Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Beth Ann Gerstein, and I'm the Executive Director of AMOCA. And I'm delighted to welcome you to today's presentation with Natalia Arbelaez. For those of you who may not know, Natalia Arbelaez is currently one of AMOCA's artists in residence. And I would like to thank the Windgate Foundation, David and Julie Armstrong, and Laguna Clay for their support of this program. And I would also like to thank Nathan Stanfield, AMOCA's studio manager, and Paul Roach, AMOCA's Director of Advancement and Communication, for their work on this program. There's additional information on the Artist in Residence program on AMOCA's website. So, a little introduction for Natalia. She holds a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree from the Florida International University and a Master of Fine Arts degree from the Ohio State University. She has been a visiting artist or a resident artist in more than a dozen schools and residency programs across the country. Her work has been exhibited in galleries and museums also across the country, including in AMOCA's We the People Serving Notice back in 2017. She has a one-person exhibition coming up at Mindy Solomon Gallery in Florida, and she is also co-founder and organizer of the Color Network, an organization that aids in the advancement of people of color in the ceramic arts. She's heading back east in late June to go to Watershed Center for Ceramic Arts in Maine for a residency with the Color Network that was funded by the National Endowment for the Arts. Please join me in welcoming Natalia Arbelaez.
Hello, thank you for having me. Thank you, Beth, and thank you, AMOCA. Thank you, Dave Armstrong, and thank you everyone for having me here and for joining. I'm just gonna share my screen. Go. Can you see everything, Beth? Okay. Okay. So I start off my presentations in a kind of a personal place to talk about how my work has gotten to where it's at and why I make the work that I make. So it's taken a long time to realize myself as a storyteller. And this is the work that actually kicked off that work. And I started this work in 2016, where a lot of the political climate was very negative towards immigration and immigrants and people of color. And I started thinking about value and giving value to myself and my stories and my family stories. So I started about thinking about ways I can highlight and celebrate these stories as in the media and politically, it was almost being looked at as patriotic to be against immigration. And some of my own family stories, I felt that way. So I started this series called Stories of My History. And this is the kickoff piece. This is the first piece that made me realize that. And this one is called Stories of Our History. And through telling these stories, through documenting these stories and just writing them down and then going back to my family, to my mother, to my father, and even the stories I kind of slightly know, just asking for them again because you get little bits and pieces. And as it's sometimes stories can be painful, sometimes shameful. They tend to change and shift over time, and sometimes you get a little more information, or sometimes things change. So this was the piece that made me realize that I wanted to document and create tangible pieces and permanent pieces about my family's immigration story of coming to America, and not only for myself and to celebrate, but as for my family and my son, that I wanted to pass down these stories with pride and to share these stories. So this is a self-portrait of him and I, and it's kind of like looking at oneself. So, and I created this work while I was a resident at the Clay Art Center in Port Chester, New York. And I think being away from school and not being under critique, I was able to visit like vulnerable stories, and I have more of a nurturing environment around me that I could visit these personal stories. So like this story is the story of my mother's immigration story, that she came to America from Colombia, Medellin, where we're from, at the age of 16 while she was pregnant with me. And there's a sense of a little bit of shame as a growing up and her telling me this story. And even when I was collecting these stories from my family, my mother was very hesitant and said she wants to keep her stories and just to leave her out of it. And but eventually she changed her mind and she said she's very proud of it. But I think it's this kind of questioning of what was legal and the fear of that and being able to share those stories. So I wanted to, as other Americans get to share their stories, have pride, talk about where they came from, I wanted that same history, and I wanted to create my own American history with documenting these. So it was a way to celebrate my mother's story and also to help bestow upon her that pride that I feel for my family coming over, as well as my father. So my father's journey was a bit different. He wasn't able just to come over to the States. So to join my mother, he was also a teenager while he was 19. He had to take a plane from Colombia to Panama, from Panama to the Bahamas, and then he took a boat. He was stranded in the Bahamas for a few weeks because he ran out of money. Then he was stranded at sea for a few weeks as well because the boat broke down. And then eventually him and the person that brings people to the States got to Cat's Cay, which is an island off the Keys. It's a residential like yacht island, and he was left on one of the decks for a few weeks as well, and he almost died throughout his journey. And this one, as well as celebrating those stories, is to think about the value that is given on certain lives and who gets that value and who doesn't. So the person that owned the boat left him on that island, and I remember him telling me that he was crying to the man, "Please don't leave me here because I will die." And the guy said, "Well, I have to come back for my boat, and if you're still here, I'll take you to Miami." But just that value that was not given to this 19-year-old boy, and that just makes me think and I want to give that value to my family. So eventually he was saved by another boat, and it took him 30 days to get to America through plane, sea, and all of that. So it's a way to talk about immigration and how that sometimes the legality might not be clear, but my family is a very hardworking family, and to talk about the stories and the hardworking people that they are and the cultural and richness that they bring to my life and I feel to America. So a little bit about my family. These are the Colombian mountains. These are the mountains that I would say from Medellin, where my family's from. Medellin sits in a valley and is surrounded by mountains, and you will see that often throughout my work. And when you see a lot of triangles in pre-Columbian work, that's often referencing the mountain. So I do often talk back a lot about that and speak about the mountains and coming from the mountains. So, and then a little bit about some of the people from Colombia and where I get my references and research from. The Muisca people are from Colombia. These are some of the people where you hear the story of El Dorado comes from, and there's a lot of gold that I am influenced by them. The Quimbaya as well, a lot of gold. And these are all pre-Columbian, so I think that they are people that have since disappeared since the Spanish came over. So this is some of my thesis work when I went to Ohio State through 2012 to 2015. And this is where at a point where I actually started to look at pre-Columbian work and was influenced by that. So I started looking at more zoomorphic forms. So initially I started to look at the forms in the pre-Columbian and Colombian Peruvian ceramics, more of the things that I found that I grew up with, of like the cartoons, the humor, and the simpleness and the essence of a body, and not specifically trying to reference a body, but it was more about just giving enough information to say that this was a human, or that this was a form, or this was referencing a form. So initially I started with a white clay body, a stoneware body that I covered an engobe, and you could see to the right this surface that I was slip trailing to mimic porcelain, because originally I was doing porcelain, and then I moved to stoneware, and eventually you'll see I moved to terracotta. So here's a quimbaya piece I would say really initially started influencing my work, with the, you know, the simpleness of the eyes, and that's where I started getting those, and, you know, just a slash for the mouth, just enough information to say that you were looking at a body. This is quimbaya. This is one of the muisca pieces. These are Colombian golden death masks that were placed on the dead. So this is where a lot of my facial features are coming from, a lot of those grimaces. And here's a piece. So the thing about being here in the States and growing up in the States, I've been away from family, and I've had to miss on significant life events like funerals, birth and death, and celebrations of life. So my work interweaves these personal narratives with these historical objects that I'm looking at, like the Colombian death mask that you just saw, and bringing them together. So I'm thinking of ways of how can I talk about these personal narratives and bring these historical pieces into the work. And eventually, as I was looking at more of the objects, I started thinking more about the histories and where these pieces were coming from. And this is the story of El Dorado. It showed you from the Muisca people. And these events took place in the same places where, you know, I was going back and forth sometimes as a younger person to Colombia. Same mountains I was running in, same places that I was living. And this is the story of El Dorado. And the story is the Muisca chief Zipa would cover himself in gold head to toe and take gold offerings to the sun and go to the lake of Guatavita and throw these objects into the lake. And it was an offering to the sun. So that's one variation of the story. Another variation of the story is that of the Spanish coming over to South America looking for this gold. And, you know, they came over to Colombia and drained a bunch of lakes and actually spent more money than what that they found. So this was in 2018, and I made this work when I received Emerging Artists, NCCA Emerging Artist, and this was a turning point in my work where I switched to terracotta. I had wanted to, as I was looking at more of the historical objects, and I was more and more interested in the gold. I felt that it was honest to the material to bring these two materials together, as I feel historically terracotta is seen as such a lesser material in the ceramic history. And I'm using this gold and I'm speaking about my land, and you know, these two materials are found side by side. They're found in the mountains, they're found in the rivers, and a lot of people from South America didn't value one necessarily higher than the other. It was more about the symbolism and what ritual was taking place. And sometimes the gold was actually covered in copper or silver and other materials to reference, you know, symbolism. So it wasn't as material. It wasn't this high material as other people, especially coming from Europe, valued. So here's some of the historical objects that I was looking at. On the left, you have a papora that's used to store lime for the coca leaves that were being chewed. And on the right, you have the little gold objects that I'm creating as I look at these historical objects, and also insert my own narratives, and also looking at ceramics as well. So I weave all of these different things together. So around, I'd say, I think it's 2017, we started seeing a lot more shows talking about what it is to being an American. And there was two shows that actually happened around at the same time. One was called Us and the other one was called US. And this one was called Us, and it was at the Clare Art Center. And they asked some artists to speak of what it is to be an American. And I spoke of how some would consider me an American because I'm an anchor baby. This is called anchor baby, and I will speak about being called that word, not maliciously, but maybe not knowing what that means. So I started making work about the experience of being an American, and this was one of them. And it was to speak of immigration and to speak about my duality of how I feel as being an American, and just to talk about the whole process and to speak about my mother's citizenship and how she actually didn't gain citizenship through me, and that it actually is a long process, that you can't just come over here and give citizenship to your whole family. It's a very long process. So it was to speak of that, to speak of the duality of being proud to be an American. And my mother is the first person to be on my case when I start complaining about things and reminding me of the privilege of and the things that I get to have, and that other countries have it so much worse. But then on the other hand, of how people of color are treated. So it's just the duality of that. And then at the same time, the show was happening in Washington, and I was speaking about immigration as well, but just in a different way. So we were asked to work on that. And I talked about the Statue of Liberty and kind of looked at the history of where it came from, and, you know, the different goddesses that were being looked at, and then just thinking of it as a cultural and American symbol, using women and immigration as that symbol, and just kind of thinking about when that gift was received in the United States and when they erected the statue, and the whole process of that, of who was allowed citizenship at that time. And, you know, women were only given citizenship of where their husband had citizenship. There was only a few Black people that were allowed citizenship. Native Americans weren't given citizenship at that time. So it's kind of looking at then, you know, and thinking about our time now of like, who is the ideal immigrant coming over to then. And though things have changed a lot, there's still an ideal immigrant of, and, you know, the president at the time was, you know, made the comment of that only people from shithole countries want to come over here. And I found that very offensive. And it definitely stated that there was a certain type of immigrant that he wanted, or that people wanted to come over to the States. So that was speaking of that. So as I started getting more research based and kind of giving myself that authority, I did a residency at the ceramic program at Harvard University. And with that residency, I was allowed to use their libraries and their collections, like the Peabody collection. So I started interacting upfront and personally with actual objects. And this authority gave me my giving myself that own authority and being like, yes, I'm a researcher. The work that I am doing is research. And I often, when I go to schools and visit young artists, I tell them, but you know, you have to take this authority, and if we want to change history or help narrate it and dictate it, we have to give ourselves that authority. So while I was there, I started researching mostly Peruvian ceramics, because there was a plethora there, specifically moche vessels, like the one that you saw. And looking more into it, when I started researching, you know, I want to think about the people, what the language, a little bit about the cultural history, not just the objects itself. So as I was doing my research, I learned that the Mochita language was lost in the 1920s, and I was thinking how that was not that long ago to lose a whole language, and how we're losing these histories, these cultures, and this information. And I started thinking of how can my work help preserve a little bit and speak of that. So as I was looking into that, I went to the next language that is similar and spoken in the same area, which is the Quechua language, one of the largest indigenous language in South America, and named them after the stirrup, which is meant to mimic two rivers coming together to become one. And that's where a lot of rituals took place and what they were meant for. So it's called Mayu Chimpe, which means cross rivers. So I started making those. And in that time as well, I started incorporating into my work some Maiolica. So I started really thinking about the history of these materials and where they're coming from. You know, I was thinking about more in the natural way of like, where are they found? And then I started thinking about the other materials like the Maiolica glaze that I started incorporating, and how the Spanish brought it over in 16th century around there, and brought it to Central and South America, and thinking about those histories and eventually thinking about how that became a metaphor for my ancestry of being indigenous and Spanish, and this, you know, all this history coming together. So I started making work about these two ancestries coming together and kind of the fight for the land that happened, and wanted to talk about the value of certain ancestries over other ones. So I started pairing figures together to speak of the duality of that and incorporating the Maiolica. So I wanted to speak about how Maiolica historically has been used to cover terracotta to mimic porcelain, but it's a metaphor for colorism, colonization, and how we look at our histories. You know, when I talk to my family about our ancestry, everyone could trace back to the Spanish and will proudly speak of that, but we don't have our indigenous ancestry, and it's still a hard topic where, you know, I grew up being called, if I was being unruly, like Indian, or when somebody is too dark, you call them redskin, and there's like this ingrained self kind of hate, especially going back home to Colombia, that I don't think now we're thinking of it, but growing up, we didn't think about where is this coming from, and why do we have this prejudice against ourselves and, you know, some of our ancestors and the people who are currently still living in Colombia who are indigenous. So so I started making this work speaking of that history and wanting to pair pieces up to talk of the hierarchy of that, the material and that history. So I'm pairing like that Spanish ancestry over the indigenous ancestry and talking about these materials with adding the gold and the Maiolica. So as well as creating that work, I eventually started to come back to the El Dorado work. I feel that I tend to work in circles, that I'll, you know, think of an idea and flesh it out and then leave it for a bit, but then I'll come back to it. And I think this was in 2019, 2020, I came back to El Dorado and thinking about those histories and feeling how can I insert myself and how can I claim and reclaim those stories, and felt if I could put myself in those narratives and reenact and recreate those stories, that I could somehow reclaim them for myself. So I started dressing up and completing the rituals of some of these stories, like the El Dorado story, and actually went to the lake that I live on and threw some objects as a reference for the story. And I also made some video work speaking of that, and I will play that. So that just loops and keeps playing. And it's actually, that one's actually playing at the Everson right now, and they blew it up life size. So I can't wait to get to see it at the end of the summer sometime. It'll be kind of intimidating to see it that large. But so all this work I created for my exit show at Harvard, and I had that video and those photographs and some of the objects here. And I'd say the video is a description of talking about my hybrid experience of being this American Colombian mestizo, like after school latchkey cartoon upbringing person, and all these identities come together to speak of who I am today. And it's through all of these histories and all of these contemporary influences that create this hybrid of who I am. So, and I felt that reenacting these stories, you know, really gave me something. And it was being able to complete these on my own and in private, but, you know, still having the photographs to document this. But it's an act that I feel really is for me, and being able to complete these rituals have become almost, I wouldn't say a spiritual act for me, but it's something for me that I'm not ready to share in person. But so on the left, I have the performance of, this one is called Rituals for Gonzalez, and on the right is for my grandmother. And being away from family, I missed out on my grandmother's funeral and I didn't have a chance to enact in the ritual or the grieving. So I created, using ancestral rituals and these historical rituals, to give myself the opportunity to create ritual and mourn for myself. And I've found myself recently interested in creating these acts that you know, that are not tangible, with these actual, which is on the right, these tangible objects of those rituals. So I've been interested in like the parallels of those. So after I completed my residency at the ceramic program at Harvard, I did a 6-month residency at Mad Museum that's in New York City. It's right across the street from, it's on Columbus Circle. It's right across the street from this big gold Christopher Columbus statue that I had to look at. And I proposed to them that I wanted to go through their permanent collection and look at women of color in ceramics who have played a role in creating history in ceramics. So with the help of Angelique, she helped me go through a list of the women. That was 11 women in total, and it was a way to celebrate and highlight, but also speak of the small number of these women that are in collections. So I took my time there and did mostly research, went through some of their files thanks to Angelique, and you know, spent my time there. And then once I left, I completed the work. But I chose 5 women out of the 11, you know, based off of women who I felt connected to, whose aesthetic I was interested in, and whose work might not necessarily be in the history books. So I was, in researching all of this, these are things that I missed. I did not see in academia that I missed out. And I would say that that is the truth as well for the end work. These are all gaps that I have felt in academia and in my life. So I've taken it upon myself to fill those gaps and to try to help a little bit through my research. So one of the artists that I chose is Lucy Lewis, who is a Pueblo potter, who was one of the first potters to step out as an individual. Normally, in that area, indigenous potters would make as a group and not sign work. And she decided to start signing work, and also started changing some of the motifs a little bit and adding personal touches. And she started to submit to shows herself. So as well as looking at the history of these women, I was interested in them personally, and and making work about them to celebrate them and to bring them a little bit more publicly. So this is Lucy Lewis. Some of the things that I learned about her was she didn't speak English and she was very shy. So I was interested in getting a little bit of their personality in there as well. Catherine Choi, who I'll show you in a second. So this is my piece, Catherine Choi. And I researched a lot of her forms. So I created one of her forms and I placed her on top of it. And Catherine Choi actually opened the Clay Art Center in, I feel it was in 1958, and she died a year later, I believe in 1959, at the age of 29. And a lot of people don't know Catherine Choi's work because she died so young and didn't have a legacy to leave her work onto. So I feel that it's important for me to continue her legacy and get her name out there and make sure that her name is being a part of history, this ceramic history, as she created space for me to work in, and she created a space for so many. So I want to create space for her as well. And I had the chance to, as well as working at the Mad Museum, go to the Clay Art Center and handle some of her pieces and be in a place that she created. Margaret Ponce Israel is an artist that I did not know of at all before looking at the collections, and I feel that she was making work in about 70s, and her work was on par of Eva Hesse and Nevelson. She as well died not as young, but kind of young, and didn't have a legacy to leave off to. And I think that that's the thing when you're a woman artist. You have, especially back then, you either you make work and you don't have children, and then sometimes your legacy stops there because there's no one to continue the work that you've been doing, or you had to become a mother. You had to become a home work at home, and you had children, so that kind of affected your career back then. So, and I created this piece talking about her forms, and I think she was one of my favorite, her work wise, in the 5 women that I chose. And she worked at the Greenwich House. She was local to New York, and she was a Cuban woman artist. And I think that she came over in the Peter Pan, when a lot of Cubans came over as children. Patty Warshina, where I actually had a great opportunity of speaking with Patty. So this project not only has been, amazing to document all these women, but I've made some really great relationships, and it's been a really rich experience. And, I got to speak with Patty on the phone and just ask her about, how did she navigate the field in the 60s and 70s, and, as a woman of color as well, and just hearing her family's narrative, and her narrative was really amazing. So on the right, she has a piece that is a golden kiln, and she told me of when she was going to school, it was very male dominated, and that they didn't allow women to be part of the kiln building process, and how she started creating little kilns on her own. I think that was her way of, if you're not going to allow me to be part of this process because you think that's man's work, I'm going to take it upon myself and make kilns in my own way. And on the right, the muscle car with all the flames is hers, and the little pigtail red lady's hers as well. So eventually her kilns turned into these macho cars, and she was speaking of the macho culture in ceramics and making these kiln cars. And her, on the top, the little red and white figure is her signature pigtails. So on the left, I put Patty on a car talking about her work, but also talking about her and her pigtails, and talking about what a trailblazer she is in the field and how she's made a path for us, and just really wanting to celebrate Patty. Sana Mususama, who I think is going to get to go to Watershed with us this summer, so really excited. She's also local to New York, and I got to have some really great conversations with her as well. And so Sana actually does a lot of traveling, especially to Asian countries. And, she spoke to me a lot about what it is to travel as a single Black woman and that experience of that and going through all these countries. And what I took from her, and she's such a positive light and such a positive person, and her travels is such an important part in her work, that I placed Sana a bit on top of the world with a little plane to speak of her travels. So, oh yeah, so those are some of the women that I've been doing, and here at AMOCA, and I'm continuing this project that I'm doing. I'm slowly going through the collection with the help of Beth, and trying to decipher who is who and document that. And I'm still in the process on my website of documenting all these women in the collections, whether I highlight them in my own work or not. I think it's important. There's something of value when these women are in collections that I think is important. So eventually I'll get to the archiving work that I need to, where I will have lists from which collection I visited, and all the women, whether they've been created in ceramics or not. And yeah, so stay tuned and look at my website. I eventually will have those women up, and then AMOCA will become part of that project as well. And one last thing that I want to speak about is the Color Network. And if you don't know of it already, it's a really great tool for any person that's looking to broaden their palette or roster of artists. If you're, curating a show, or just looking to find new artists, or whether you're a teacher, or if you're an artist of color and you're looking to network, the Color Network is a place where we create networks, we share opportunities, and just a place where you can ask a question or look for guidance. But yeah, it's a labor of love, and I always want to share that.
Thank you, Natalia. That was great. Sort of always good to learn more about your process and your work, even though I've had the pleasure of spending time with you here. Are there any questions from those on the call that you would like to ask Natalia? And either you can type it in, or if you want to unmute yourself, I think we could manage that as well. It's a quiet group. How have you found, actually, Gina Brownstein has a question. Gina, do you want to unmute?
Yes, please. Hi. I just wanted to thank you and to share that on this call right now, I'm a high school teacher in Los Angeles, in Glendale, and on this call you have a lot of my students, my advanced students. I requested to attend this talk, so about I think 15 of the people in here right now are from my class, and I just wanted to ask you, they're high school students, and I wanted to ask you if you had advice for young artists. I think I really enjoy hearing your influence of how you're looking at things but not copying them or getting influenced about things without without plagiarizing them. But I wanted to know if you would share a little bit about your early influences, like how you found yourself as an artist.
Yeah,
thank you so
absolutely.
much.
Yeah, I'd say at first, because I came from a home that was, my mother, English was a second language to her, so I think it was hard to take on that title of, researcher or storyteller. At first my work was about movies or television or things that I was exposed to. I grew up on the TV, and that was kind of my literature early on. And I think that that's fine to, make with what is around you, and that's fine. And influences over time change or just add on. And I'd say I still am very heavily influenced by cartoons. I grew up on Ren and Stimpy, and I still love cartoons. So Adventure Time. So I'm like pairing these like historical serious objects with cartoons like Ren and Stimpy, or the features of that, because it's all about me, and all of those experiences and all those things I was exposed to is all about me. So I think about best advice is just keep going. And it took me a long time to get here. I first started in community college, and my first couple semesters I don't remember if I dropped out or I wasn't doing so well, so I'd have to leave the semester and come back. But I never stopped. I kept going. There's a lot of obstacles in place, but I think that and I grew with a few friends that became artists, and some people that just eventually, I think, quit. I think it's just important to keep going and know that there's going to be things that come in the way. But if you just kind of keep trying to go, it eventually, you'll find a way. And it does take a while. For me, and I don't think necessarily that everyone has to go that way. Education really helped me because it gave me time, space, and financial resources, because I was able to get financial aid and things like that. So yeah.
Thank you. CJ Gillick asked a question that for the students that are on the call, could you speak to your experience at various residencies, what you would look for in a residency, advice of how to approach participating in a residency, as well as applying? Yeah,
I think my first residency was at Watershed. I got a fellowship there, so I would maybe at first look at the smaller residencies that you could get into, whether it's like Watershed or Airmount, or becoming an assistant first, before if finances is an obstacle. That's how I went about it first. And I got a fellowship through Art Access that paid my way for Watershed, and then at Airmount I was an assistant to an artist. So I think just reaching out to people, seeing as artists move around and asking if they need an assistant. I think just asking people that way. So then that's where I first started. And then I got a residency at the Clay Art Center in Port Chester, which was for a year. And I'd say that I've learned through moving through residency is really think about the demographic that the area is serving, and how you're interested in giving back to that community, or how you can interact with that community is really important, as well as like the immediate. So I'm talking about demographic of like, where does that residency, what kind of city it is, who are the surrounding of that residency, and then also thinking about the demographic within that community and how you could give back and how you could receive from that. So I think really looking at all those things is important, and to what the residency has to offer you and you have to offer them. So I think right now it's been that I actually want to use collections in different places, like the Mad Museum. I think they were really interested in that because I was using the resources that they have, and I don't know too many artists that were going through that program that were doing that. And I'm not sure for AMOCA yet, maybe Beth could tell me, but I approached it that way. I really wanted to keep doing this project that I was doing, but I wanted to use their collection through that. So that was one of the things that I spoke of when wanting to do this residency. So yeah, I really think about the resources. And then when I did the ceramic program at Harvard, I really was looking at the Peabody collection, which is on the main campus of Harvard, and how I wanted to use that and their library. So really think about what they have to offer and how you can use it, and set a plan in place for how you can use those resources. But also, like, don't forget about what you could do to give back.
Thank you. And another question from Jeffrey Warnock, who loves your work. And his question is, have you ever embraced some of the early firing methods used in Columbian history?
No, I wish that I could do some pit firing, but it's just very, very involved, that I haven't had the chance to. But yeah, not yet. I'm hoping to, I haven't even made in Colombia. I've made pieces in Colombia because my dad actually owns a tile factory, but I've never had the chance of firing it. So that's like the next step. That's like the dream of like, I really want to make back home, or figure out how to interact or with people from back home and make in that kind of way. So I think that I see that in the future happening. But I feel like I'm moving further away from that and changing some of my firing techniques.
Any other questions from our audience? And feel free to raise your hand or unmute. And Alyssa, if you want to unmute.
Hi, thanks for a wonderful presentation. What are some of the challenges you've encountered doing residencies with a child? Or do you find those institutions supportive, with a family? I feel like both, having a child and being an artist, it's both two kinds of creative work.
Yeah, it's hard. It's really hard. And I say that, I've encountered obstacles as being a person of color, just like from navigating as a young person, but I've never faced discrimination. But I'd say I'd faced discrimination being a mother in the arts, definitely. So at first, when I was moving through spaces, especially when I went to grad school and some of the first residencies I did, I just I didn't say I was a mother. I kind of hid that. I hid that part of my life because I was afraid that people were going to judge me or not provide me with opportunities because they were going to think I was not as committed. And I think I've been working a little bit and making a name for myself. So it wasn't until I did my Harvard residency, the ceramic program at Harvard, where I approached Kathy King, and I was actually able to speak to her and say, I want to do this, and I have a family and I want to go home every weekend but do this residency. And she was totally on board and completely understood, and all for it. So it's taken some time, and I feel like I'm still figuring it out. And I just have a really supportive partner who we take turns doing the things we want to do. And I am just trying to not feel guilty. That's the thing that I deal with personally. And I've been thinking about that because a lot of people, when they hear I'm here, they tell me I'm so lucky. And then I just think of like, I wonder if men are told the same thing of like when they get to travel for work and do the things that they do, if they're so lucky that they get to do that. And I'm just thinking of like those things that we shouldn't tell mothers that, because it's saying that like I'm lucky to have this opportunity, and I feel like we should all have this opportunity. And yeah, I'm not sure. I'm still working on that and trying to move through spaces. And I think talking about it will help. And I think asking men the same questions that we're asking women will be really important too. Yeah.
Thank you for that question. Are there any other questions? And I also want to remind folks that Natalia's with us until about the third week in June. And if you're interested in coming for a brief visit with masks, we can probably work out limited access. The museum will be opening to members in early June, and by mid-June will be open to the public. But the studio is not officially open to the public. So if you're interested in coming to see what she's been up to before she ships it all to Florida, we'd be happy to try to accommodate visits. So, well, thank you all. Any last call? And if not, I want to thank you again, Natalia. This was really a wonderful presentation. I want to thank you all for joining us.
Thank you for coming.
Bye.